Well, you caught me. I'm wandering around outside again. I guess this is just how I do intros now. But I have good reason. My guest today has written almost 20 books on topics like Druidry and herbalism. So it only seemed appropriate to be out in nature when I did this introduction. And while I have to drive about 20 minutes from my house to get to a secluded and wooded area like this, she just has to step out her back door. Operator, connect me to Evert Hopman. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian, and today I'm speaking to Evert Hopman. Ellen is a master herbalist, the author of several books, including Celtic Druidry, Rituals, Techniques, and Magical Practices, which we'll talk about soon. And she's been a druidic initiate since 1984. Ellen, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And to start off, could you tell me a little bit about your background?
That's a long story.
I like long stories.
Well, I live in Massachusetts, first of all, and it's cold. It just got cold today. But I live in an oak forest. I am a druid, and so that's very convenient. I was born in Austria, and that's where I first heard about the Celts through my mother, who was an artist, who talked about the Celts because she was very interested in archaeology, and there was a lot of archaeology digs going on when I was born and before I was born. And she would talk about the Celts, and I promptly forgot about it. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I heard that word when I was listening to Irish music for the first time, which blew my mind. And I loved it so much that I became a Cayley dancer. Can't do that anymore because my knees are terrible. But I still love Celtic music played on acoustic traditional instruments. That's what I like. And boy, I spent a whole summer in Scotland, have been to Ireland numerous times. There's just a lot that went on. But anyway, when I was in Scotland in the island of Iona, excuse me, that was where I heard the word druid spoken out loud for the first time. And I immediately resonated with it because on Iona, which is in the Hebrides in the Western Isles, they tell stories about the Druids, and it was a sacred island of the Druids, Inis nan Druidniach, the Isle of Druids, it was called, also Inis Ivrach, or the Isle of Yew. Yew, of course, is a very sacred tree, and I have a book called A Druid's Herbal of Sacred Tree Medicine, if anybody knows about that, but I have a whole chapter on yew in there. So I heard the word druid, and then I took it in and then went back to the States, and I was working full-time as an herbalist, and one of my clients mentioned that she had met a druid while I was taking her case. And, my ears just picked up, and it took me a while to find druids because I was not on the internet. There was no internet. It was in the 80s. But the druids that I eventually found were ADF and Isaac Bonowitz, and that was the druid she had met, was Isaac. And I got my second circle initiation from Isaac in 1986, and then co-founded the Henge of Keltria because there were a bunch of us who wanted a Celtic Druid order, which was a new idea at the time. So we created the Henge of Keltria. And then in 1996, I created a Yahoo group called White Oak. And the reason it was called that is because I walked outside and I asked the trees, what should I call it? And they said, call it White Oak. What I didn't know at the time was the largest white oak on the East Coast was 20 minutes from my house. I didn't even know that. So that was the chieftain tree for this area. And that was a really important 1 year discussion that went on. I pulled together the most important Druid minds that I could think of. Everybody came together and we talked for an entire year about what is a Druid, what a Druid is not, what kind of training should they have, what should they read, what kind of tools should they have, and so on. And eventually, at the end of the year, we realized we had all the makings of a Druid order. So that became the Order of White Oak. I was co-chief there with Craig Malia, who's English. And then White Oak disbanded around 20. What century are we in? 2014. And so I couldn't bear the idea of letting go of all the lessons. And so I then, all by myself, created Tribe of the Oak, which is going strong, I'm happy to say. 10 years later, we have a new Archdruid. I just stepped down and we have a new male Archdruid, which is very nice. He's revamping the study program. Our website is tribeoftheoak.org. If anybody's interested, and it's a somewhat scholarly group. We expect people to do reading and really learn the old material, and mostly Irish. So that kind of brings you up to date. Up to date. That's where we are now.
Okay, great. So you did just mention a link there, and for anybody that's watching or listening later, I will post all of the links and all of the resources mentioned in the video description below. So all you have to do is click. Now, I have a lot of questions about the Druids, but before I get into those, can you tell me about your most recent book release?
Okay, well, this book, Celtic Druidry, Celtic Druidry Rituals, Techniques, and Magical Practices, came out a few months ago, in May 2024. And basically, because I was stepping down as Archdruid, well, I've been trying to step down for a few years. I was in the process of trying to find somebody. We did have an election, I'm happy to say. So the new Archdruid was elected. But for a couple of years, I was really trying to find somebody. And during that period, once again, I just, after that seminal 1 year period where we talked about what is a Druid for an entire year, I just couldn't bear the idea of losing any of that. So what I did was I took what I considered to be the most important points, obviously not the lessons, because you have to go to Tribe of the Oak to get the lessons, but I touched on every aspect of what I thought a student who was a Druid student should know. So what I do is I just give little snippets of each different subject, and then I give you further information for how to learn more. So book lists, footnotes, there's no assumption here that I am the ultimate authority. I am the great Archdruid. Only this book is authentic, so you better buy it now. It's not like that. It's more like, here are the important things of what it means to be a Druid, and here's where you can go to get more.
So what is a Druid?
One could write an entire book about that. Well, there's many different kinds of Druids, and I discuss that in the book as well. There are people, you will find them, who say all you have to do is love trees, and that makes you a Druid. Okay, there's lots of people like that. You love nature, that makes you a Druid. Or it doesn't matter, the ancient stuff doesn't matter, just do whatever you want. Nobody knows anything about the Druids, so you might as well just make it all up. That's another point of view. But those are people that have not taken the time to actually study anything, because once you start looking into it, there's a lot of material. Especially, we focus on the Irish material because we have 6th and 7th century writings that were written down by monks which is both bad and good. The good thing is that they preserved the teachings, the stories, the gods, the goddesses, all that is written down. So we have it. The bad news is they would often edit and, change things. But we have the ancient tribal laws. They're called the Brehon laws. We have the bee laws. We have the farming laws. It's just, we have the laws of the poets. There's a great book called the Urakechnarir, which goes year by year and tells you exactly what you need to know to be a poet, and the different grades of poets and how much they knew, how many stories they knew, how many different Ogham alphabets. There were many different Ogham alphabets. That's all outlined right there. And of course, a bard is a type of druid. So there's that. And then we have the wisdom tales. We have ancient poetry that's 2,000 years old. The Song of Amergin is very famous, for example. I am the wind on in the sea and the waves of the ocean. A lot of people know that poem. But anyway, there's a lot out there. But the thing is, it takes years. You really have to read and learn. There are a lot of books. There are great books out there. There's archaeology, there's linguistics, there's folklore. It's worth looking into folklore because a lot of traditions have been preserved. But again, you have to be willing to put the time in. And a lot of people now, they think they're learning just by going on TikTok. And yes, that's not what this is at all. And the Druids, of course, in ancient times were the experts. To be a Druid was to be an expert. And they were the intellectuals of the tribes. They were the knowledgeable people. They were called the Aesdana, the people of arts, the people who knew stuff. The lawyers, the doctors, the judges, the magicians, the sacred singers, the poets, the ritualists. Those were the Druids. So they, it was not a solitary thing. You didn't have a solitary old guy with a beard wandering around in the woods. That's not a Druid. A Druid is a tribal function. They are experts at something. They advise the nobles and the royalty. They teach the children of the nobility, and they serve the tribe. They always serve the tribe.
So I think the word druid for a lot of people is kind of a loaded term, and it brings up pictures of some people wearing cloaks, walking around a fire in the woods or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you describe it, these are really just the educated people in this society. Now, was it all magic related, or were they doing more mundane things as well?
No, they were doing really practical things. They were the ambassadors, they were the judges, they were the lawyers, they were the doctors. That was, but magician is a type of druid. I mean, one druid was not an expert in all things. They probably knew a little tiny bit of each thing, but they were experts in one particular area. So one druid might be an expert in the law. Another druid might be an expert in healing, But it's like in our culture, we would call them a doctor or a master. If you have a master of arts or a PhD, it's like that. They had PhDs. They were called Olavs, the people that were fully trained.
So earlier you said you guys founded a Celtic Druid order, right? And you said that was kind of a novel idea at the time. Why was that? Why was that a different idea?
Well, at that time there was Obod, which was English. There are a lot of Americans in Obod now, but at that time Obod was mostly English. Created of a lineage that goes back to the Masons. And they were a lot of them were Christian, so it was just there are a lot of Masonic Druid orders still in Britain. AOD, for example, Ancient Order of Druids and so on. But they go back to the 1700s. They were all men when they began. William Blake was one of them. He was a Druid. Winston Churchill was a Druid. Even the Queen of England was a Druid, Elizabeth, until she got kicked out. But that's another story. But anyway, so there was the English side of things, okay? Not terribly Celtic, somewhat Celtic, but very Christian, New Agey kind of, okay? And then ADF was the largest group in the United States, and they were Indo-European. So when I was a member, and I was one of the first members, there were only 30 of us at the time, Isaac was teaching people that, you could be a Polish Druid or a Russian Druid or a Scandinavian Druid, a Norse Druid, you could be any kind of Druid. And a bunch of us, there were 6 of us, and we sat around the fire and we talked, and we said, gee, we happen to know that the Druids are part of Celtic culture. So the only, to be a Druid, you got to be part of a Celtic tradition. And so we created the Henge of Keltria.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference in practice between how a modern Druid would practice versus some of the ancient Druids?
Oh boy. Well, the old Druids did not write down anything. Okay. So we don't know how they practiced. All we have is what the monks wrote down, because before that, the Celtic tradition was very rich. It wasn't that they were illiterate, but it was an oral society. So the knowledge, the teachings, the poetry, the stories, everything was passed down orally, Druid to Druid. Okay. And that was done to preserve the traditions intact, and preserve the franchise, so that other people couldn't claim it. You had to study with a teacher for 20 years, according to Caesar. And anyway, so then the monks come along and they write stuff down. That's all we have to go on. So all we can do is just piece together bits of, folk tradition and things from the stories. We pull out things. I mean, it takes years. I've written a lot of books, but in my books, that's what I've done, and other people have done. But there's certain thing, for example, the Carmina Gadelica, which comes out of the Western Isles of Scotland. Though that was written down around 1900, but it was taken from the oral tradition and the folklore of the Hebrides of Scotland. A lot of the material is Christian or Christianized, but some of it is purely pagan, which is very nice. So you just kind of have to read through it, and you pick out the actual practices, and you put it together. That's all we can do, and we're very clear about that. We don't pretend that we are, the ancient Druids in an unbroken lineage. There is no unbroken lineage. There are people who like to say that there is, but there isn't. There really isn't. It's been 2,000 years. So it's work. It takes a lot of work. But when you're creating rituals or any kind of, prayers, invocations, and so on, you need to be very honest that, I wrote this, I created this, or this is adapted from the Carmina Gadelica, or this comes from such and such a story, ancient story. This poem is by this poet from, 2,000 years ago. You have to be very precise about where you're getting your information. And there's nothing worse than an author who claims they have the only authentic Druid tradition out there. And when we see that, we cringe. It's horrible.
So in your book, you describe a few times how there are some parallels between the Druids and like Hindu mythology and stuff like that. Can you explain a little bit about that? I found that very interesting.
Well, this is where the Indo-European thing that Isaac was talking about, there is legitimacy to it there, because I like to think of the old Celtic religion as the western end of the Indo-European tradition, and Hinduism is the eastern end. Both come from the Vedic culture. And it's just that one group went south into India, which was Dravidian at the time, and created Hinduism. The other group went west, and the social structure is identical. So in Hinduism, you have the Brahmins, who are the sacred class, educated ritualists, teachers, priests, so on. And then among the Celts, you have the Druids, who are exact equivalent of the Brahmins. And then you have the warriors. They're called the Kshatriya in Hindu tradition. They're called the warriors in the Celtic tradition. And the king comes from the warrior class, because the king, their most important function is they have to know how to, protect the territory. That's their job. Every king had to have a druid at their side, because the druid was the one who knew the laws and the precedents. The king knew how to chop off heads. And the king had to be ritually elevated from the warrior class into the sacred class. They weren't automatically sacred. And we still have that today. We just saw King Charles ritually elevated by an archbishop, right? He had to be anointed and the whole thing. Same thing. He had to be ritually elevated. Just because he was born as a prince, that wasn't enough. He still had to go through the whole ceremony. Same thing. They would take the warrior and then elevate them to become Nemed or sacred, on par with the Druids. Okay. And then you have the farmers and producers. So in India, you would have farmers and producers. Celtic culture, farmers and producers. And then the Celtic culture had slaves, and the Hindu culture has what's called the Sudra, or the untouchables. Both do the menial, most undesirable work, like cleaning out the pigsties and, all the horrible stuff that nobody wants to do. But back in ancient times, it wasn't like you think of it now. The culture was fluid, meaning that if you had learning, the more learning you had, you could raise up. In other words, you could go from being a slave to being a farmer. You could go as far as being a druid, but that was done. It took 3 generations. So if a farmer was very successful and became very wealthy and had hundreds and hundreds of cows and so on, that farmer could not become a druid, but their grandson could become a druid, or their granddaughter. And that's in the law. It takes 3 generations. So you have to be, in other words, you were wealthy, you were well educated, you ate good food, it took 3 generations to make that transition. And you could go the other way. If you behave badly, you could be kicked down the social ladder.
That is really interesting. Beyond the societal structures, were there also some parallels to mythology or the deities that they worshipped?
Well, yes. There are. Boy, this is a huge topic. But this is something that I don't know if we can say definitively, but there's a lot of theories out there. A lot of people draw parallels between the Kalyach and Kali, for example. The Kalyach, in some areas, not everywhere, is associated, she's the old woman, right? She's the creator of the land, but in some areas, she's also the goddess of winter, the goddess of death, all the things that are dying and so on. And then you have Kali, of course, who is the goddess of death. That's just one example. Bridget, you might think of her as the equivalent of Lakshmi. Bridget is the goddess of healing, poetry, smithcraft, many arts. There's, I have a whole big chapter about gods and goddesses. and theories. It's all theories.
I think it's really interesting. Even if we never find out for sure where things came from, it's always interesting to hear the thoughts and find out just the similarities between different belief systems. Even if it doesn't come from the same source, there are similarities between so many different belief systems, and it's always interesting to find out those common threads that we have with everybody else.
Oh, I just thought of a really interesting one.
Go for it.
Well, oh boy, this is such a big topic, but there's three theories about where the Celts developed. One is that they developed along the Danube River. That's just one theory. There's another theory they came from Spain. There's another theory they came from Gaul, which is roughly France, but that's another topic. But the word Danube or Danube, also the Dnieper River, which is in Ukraine, the Don in Russia, they all come from the same root word, which is Danu, which Danu is means water in Sanskrit, sacred water. Danu.
Very interesting.
Interesting.
Well, if somebody was interested in becoming a druid today, what path would you recommend that they take?
Well, first they need to consult their own self, and they have to say, "Self, what are you up for?" And I mean, what I would recommend is not necessarily what somebody else would recommend, but I recommend that they need to read books. You can't just go on TikTok and then say, "I'm a druid," although you can, but it's better not to do that. But if you go to our website, which is tribeoftheoak.org, we have a list of basic books. We do have a training program. It takes years. It's not something that you do on a weekend and then pay $25 and you're a druid. It's not like that. We have a one-on-one fostership program where you get fostered by a druid mentor. We don't charge anything. What we do is periodically, if we need funds, for example, for web hosting, if anything expenses come up, domain renewal or whatever, we'll ask people, we'll say, can you please make a donation? And people do. They always do. And some people can give more and some people can give less and some people can't give anything, so it's up to the individual. But it takes years. I mean, I initiated people for years and I was not paid. And I did that with White Oak. I did it with Tribe of the Oak. And that means the mentor or the teacher spends typically 3 to 5 years working with each person. And I have some people that took 7 years. They took longer than that. But that means you're in constant communication and, it's a lot of work.
Is there a degree or a level system within the practice?
We just have initiates and non-initiates. That's it. Dedicants are the people that are working towards initiation, and then those who have finished their initiation, they do a ceremony, and then they become a full initiate. And once you're a full initiate, then you can start teaching others.
Okay. So I think earlier when you were talking about ADF, you said you received your second level from Isaac?
Second degree, yeah.
Second degree. Okay. So is that...
second circle is what they would have called it.
Okay.
But it's a degree system. It's the same thing. They had first circle, second circle, third circle, which is basically 3 degrees.
Okay. So it's not like every druidic order follows that same idea where it's kind of like there's just initiates and non-initiates. There's different order might have different system.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. Very interesting. Very interesting. I have so many questions about the druids. let's see, from the perspective of a druid or the Celts, can you explain the triple goddess and how that kind of differs from the modern Wiccan perception of the triple goddess?
Yeah, Wiccans have this maiden mother crone motif, which they got from Robert Graves, who was an English poet who was writing in the 1940s. The white goddess, which people think when they're reading the white goddess, they think they're getting, genuine Celtic tradition, and they're not. He made up a lot of stuff, like he made up the Celtic tree calendar. You see that online all the time. Oh, this is the month of birch, that has nothing to do with anything. He made it up. Okay. And then there's Yola Morganu, who's a Welsh druid who made stuff up. And his stuff is a mishmash of old Welsh material, but a lot of it is his own invention. And the bad part is he doesn't tell you when he's making stuff up. So people will read Yola Morganu, and they think that it's, all ancient Druid teachings, and it's not. Bardas is his big famous book. What was the question? I forgot.
The Druid perspective on what the triple goddess is versus what it is today.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the Wiccan idea is maiden mother crone. That does not exist anywhere in any ancient tradition. I defy anybody to find it. Okay. Now I do know that Wiccan writers will bend over backwards and say, well, but the maiden is the spring and the mother is the summer and the crone is okay. So that's a modern idea that has nothing to do with anything. The triple deities in ancient tradition are all the same age. So when you have Bridget, she's a triple goddess. It's Bridget, Bridget, and Bridget. It's not baby Bridget, mother Bridget, and crone Bridget. It's three women, three Bridgets. One is an expert in poetry, one is an expert in healing, and one is an expert in smithcraft. But it's a way of saying this goddess is so powerful and so knowledgeable, so competent that she's triple. She's worth three. That's the way I look at it. Same thing with Hecate. Hecate might be shown as three or one because she is a goddess, but she's three times powerful. She's so important that she's triple. Lu, the god Lu, was born of triplets. Now, he isn't usually shown as a triple deity, although we do have one statue that has a three-faced, a head with three faces, which is kind of nice. But he was born of triplets. And when you're reading the old stories, for example, Tlachga, who's the goddess of Samhain, that's a whole story, but she died giving birth to triplets. But she was so important that the Samhain fire in Ireland was lit from a place sacred to her. Anyway, so whenever you see that three, that tells you that you're dealing with a high god or goddess.
Very interesting, different perspective there from the modern way that we usually interpret things in Wicca anyway. So I guess I'm kind of curious if there are any other examples of that being applied to male deities as well. You mentioned the statue of Lu, which I have seen, but are there any other examples you're aware of where the triple aspect was applied to a god?
Yeah, Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu.
Yeah. Okay.
Same idea. Whenever you see that three, the Trimurti, three goddesses, that immediately tells you that you're dealing with the highest level of deity.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess if we look across the globe to other pantheons as well, we would see some more examples. This is kind of a weird question. I don't know if I would be able to answer this about my own practice, but if you had like a quintessential example of druidic magic, what would that be?
We know the Druids did battle magic. We know that. They put a spell on a stone and then handed it to the warrior, and the warrior threw it, and quintessential. Gee, it's interesting. In my group anyway, and I've been doing this for 40 years, magic is not the really big focus. That's not what we focus on. For us, it's more about giving praise. And as we go through the year, the fire festivals, the cross quarters are, what you would call, I am assuming you're Wiccan. I don't know, but the solstices and equinoxes are not that important. There are some minor little observances, that folk traditions that go along with the solstices and equinoxes. But the really big holy days for us are what you would call cross quarters. And what was the question? Sorry.
Quintessential example of what type of magic you might practice with it.
Okay, like I said, we don't really, that's not a huge focus. It's just not. So what we would do is at the cross quarter, what you call cross quarters, we call fire festivals, the most important festivals. They're earth festivals. Okay, so we just had Samhain. The next one is Imbolc. Then we have Bealtaine or Beltane, and then we have Lunasa, or what you call Lammas. Okay, those are the important days. And what they do is they mark stations of the agricultural year. So Samhain is the official end of the harvest. Everything has to be gathered in. Anything that is left out in the field belongs to the fairies. So it's very important to bring everything in. And we go into the dark, because everything begins in the dark. A seed in the ground begins in the dark. A baby in the womb begins in the dark. All things begin in the dark. The universe begins in the dark, So we celebrate the end of the harvest, and then we celebrate the beginning of the cycle, which is the darkness. We honor the dark. Okay, we're happy that it's dark. We're not scared of it. Well, maybe we are a little bit, but no, it's like we honor the dark, and that's really the beginning of all things. Everything comes out of the dark, and then at Imbolc, we honor Bridget, who's the fire goddess, and we give thanks for the very first fires of spring. And I know you're in Florida. I'm in Massachusetts, so it's going to look really different here. But the birds, that's the time when the light begins to really grow rapidly. So the birds start singing again in a way that they didn't all winter. The sap starts rising. Soon we get maple syrup, things like that. So anyway, that's Imbolc. And then Bealtaine or Beltane is May Day, and that's everything should be planted by then, so you can stop and have a party. And then Lunasa, or Lammas, is the beginning of the harvest. It's the beginning of the wheat harvest and the first fruits and all that. But I should say that the Celts had a lunar calendar. So this idea of having May Day on May 1st, or Lunasa on August 1st, or Samhain on November 1st, that's not Celtic. Not. Okay? The lunar calendar is very different. So the year begins at the dark of the moon in the 12th month. And that's the actual date of Samhain. It's really important on that date, the dark of the moon of the 12th month. It's a time to go within and to consult the ancestors and the spirits, because they're always here. They're always around, but that's a really good time to just stop and go inward, because that's what nature is doing. It's going within. It's starting to go down into the dark, so you do that. And then, you have winter solstice is always in the second month, the second lunar month, which is very convenient because it's a fixed date. So you always know that's the second month. The moon, there's 13 moons, right? So the dates move all over the place, but winter solstice is always somewhere in the second month. And then Imbolc is the first quarter moon of the fourth month, is it? And then Beltane is the full moon. And then Lunasa is the last quarter moon. Okay. So it's a lunar thing as well as a solar thing, but it's not fixed. The idea of things being on the first of the month comes from the Romans. Because the first of the month was sacred to the goddess Juno, and they always made offerings on the first of the month to Juno. So when they came into Gaul, when they conquered Gaul, they forced the Celts to take a Roman calendar. And then, of course, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, had the Roman calendar. So it's not Celtic.
That's really interesting. I have not thought about the fire festivals following a lunar month cycle before, so that's definitely something that
and that's
I will
in
want
the
to
book.
take a look at.
That's all in the book. So Celtic Druidry. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you this question, and now as we've been talking, I don't know if it's necessarily like a really answerable question. Because when you look, as you're talking about Druidry, and while I think about Wicca, there are so many parallels. And it seems like one may have influenced the other. And that's what I was going to ask you, is if you think Druidry has influenced Wicca today. But as we're talking, it almost seems like they are both simultaneously, at least in a modern context, evolving in parallel with one another. Do you have thoughts there?
Yeah. Well, modern Druidism and modern Wicca have a lot in common because Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols were buddies. They were both nudists, and it's fun to think of them sitting around with no clothes on. They created the eightfold wheel of the year. That's not a Celtic thing at all. So they combined Scandinavian, Germanic tradition where the solstices and equinoxes are the most important thing. And also the pre-Celtic, if you look at the monuments, for example, in Ireland, there are, and also in Britain, like Stonehenge, for example, is oriented to the winter solstice. So the pre-Celtic monuments are oriented to the solstices and equinoxes, but that's not Celtic. So if you're trying to be Celtic, it's something different. Okay. So they just sat down and they figured out this eightfold wheel of the year. They created it. And Ross Nichols was a Druid, and he went on to create Obad. And Gerald Gardner was a witch, and he went on to create Gardnerian Wicca. And he took a lot of it from Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, which, if you're Wiccan, you should read that. And you should also read The Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because that goes through all the different versions of the Book of Shadows, proving that it was all invented, which is fine. I mean, that's what everybody does, because we don't have an intact ancient tradition. We have to make it up. But the thing that, like I said before, what bothers us is when people say, "Oh, I have the only genuine ancient tradition from," whatever. That drives us nuts, So just be honest about it, If you made it up, say, "Hey, I made this up," And if it's good poetry, then hey, it might be really good. But if you're going to make, if you're a Druid, I would hope that your ritual that you made up would at least refer back to something, genuine from the ancestors. That's what I would hope.
Yeah, personal gnosis, shared gnosis, modern interpretations, modern practices are just as valid as any ancient practice. Just, you shouldn't necessarily say something is ancient if it is something that was made up recently. But I could probably ask you questions about druids for hours here. But I will shift topics a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about, because I know you have written a lot, can you tell me a little bit about some of your other books?
Well, okay, I did pick out, I think I have 17, but I picked out a few. This one, A Legacy of Druids, Philip Cargam wrote the foreword to this. And if you go to my website, EvertHopman.com, you'll see all my books, or I have an author page on Amazon, so just put in Ellen Evert Hopman author, and the author page should come up. But this book is a book of interviews that I did with Druids. It's called A Legacy of Druids, Conversations with Druid Leaders of Britain, the USA, and Canada, Past and Present. And this is, them speaking their own words. So Isaac is in here. A lot of them have now passed over, which is making this book more important as time goes on. Olivia Robertson, for example, who founded the Fellowship of Isis, who was also a Druid, Druid clan of Dana. She's in here. Tim Sebastian has passed over. Septimus Mirdvin Braun, he's passed over. Ronald Hutton is in here. Okay, there's just a lot. There's, God, I don't know. There's about 40 different interviews in here. A Legacy of Druids. So if you want to read what they actually thought about what is a Druid, that they're all talking about that in here. For the kiddies, I have this book, Once Around the Sun, which this is designed for kids, but Groves and Covens really like it. That's the Kalyach. It has fantastic illustrations. They're all original oil paintings. This one has stories, crafts, and recipes. That's La Befana. And Christmas is coming, so she's the Christmas witch. That's an Italian tradition. I go through many different cultures. This is Bridget. It's a story about young Bridget. Bridget is a young girl. And she was the daughter of a druid. There's a story about Beltane. And it's a druid student and what she goes through. Then there's a Polish story for midsummer, making the wreaths and putting them in the water. That's a Polish tradition. There's a story about Lu for Lammas or Lunasa. And I love this illustration. This is a story from Orkney for the fall equinox, and that's a mermaid. But anyway, so I wrote this. This is a great book, Once Around the Sun, Stories, Crafts, and Recipes to Celebrate the Sacred Earth Year. So this is really good if you have pagan kids in the house. And as I said, covens like it too, because the stories are designed to be read out loud in a group. And then you make the recipe, you cook the recipe that goes with the story. And these are traditional recipes. So a Polish recipe with a Polish story, an Irish recipe with the Irish story, and then there's a hands-on craft. And then this one, The Sacred Herbs of Yule and Christmas. Again, Christmas is coming. I actually have a talk coming up on December 2nd. If you go to my website, EllenEvertHopman.com, and go to the events section, I'm giving a free talk. It's through a museum in Connecticut, but it's online. You do have to register. And I'll be talking about the spirits that come out in the wintertime, and also herbs, sacred herbs, and magical and medicinal, and all the herbs that are associated with the winter season. I should also mention, sorry, there's so many books I could spend an hour to, but there's a trilogy, okay? And the first book is called Priestess of the Forest, A Druid Journey. The second book is called The Druid Isle. And the third book is called Priestess of the Fire Temple. And again, if you go to Amazon, they're all there. This is a trilogy that has rituals, prayers, invocations, incantations built into the stories. And I did that deliberately because, years ago, people started complaining. In the beginning, when I first started out, before we had the internet, everybody was thrilled to find books. We loved books. And, pagan Celtic Britain, oh my God, have you read that one? Like we would find a new book and we would just be beside ourselves. And then we would use the book to create our ceremonies, and we would read the books out loud to each other. We had study groups around the books. Earth Rights by the boards, it was a big favorite because that went through, and I still have it, but it goes through the year in Britain and talks about all the folk practices, and so we were mining the books, right? But then what I noticed was once the internet came in, people started saying they didn't want to read books. And now they just want to be on TikTok and they want a 1-minute explanation, or they want to Google something. But I took that to heart. I said, okay, they don't want to read the books. So what do? I'll create some books that would be fun to read, and get the scholarship in there. So these books, starting with Priestess of the Forest, are all based on Celtic scholarship. So, the status of the druids, what they're wearing, what they're eating, what they're doing, how they're living, you know, everything that's in here is based on scholarship, but you would never know it. Okay. And then the second book, The Druid Isle, goes to the island of Iona, which I already mentioned, in the Western Isles of Scotland. And, it's a fun story. Each story has romance, but it also has warriors, and battles and all the stuff you would expect. There's Priestess of the Forest. The third one, I'm sorry, Priestess of the Fire Temple. This one is actually based on the idea, and this is something that I read when I was doing research. Saint Bridget of Kildare, who most people have heard of, based her fire temple. She had a fire temple. It was based on an earlier pagan model. And that was just one sentence that I read. And then the whole book came out of that. So this is about the pagan temple before Bridget. So Bridget didn't just invent it out of thin air, Anyway.
Well, I love the children's book, because there aren't that many resources that I'm aware of anyway for pagan children to learn about things accessibly and in a fun way. And I also love the fact that you've tied authentic teachings into more of like a novel series, because that's fun. But a lot of your books deal with herbs, right? And you yourself are a master herbalist. So what does that mean? What does a master herbalist do?
It means that you studied with a teacher. Again, it's, I have the title. I was given the title by William Lassassier. I want to mention a couple more books. Sacred Herbs of Spring Magical healing and edible plants to celebrate Beltane, and the sacred herbs of Samhain, plants to contact the spirits of the dead. And I have a bunch of tree books also. But I studied with a teacher. So I spent 5 months apprenticing with a teacher. And then after that, and that was like in the 1980s, okay? After that, I went to many, many, many weekend workshops and, retreats and all. I mean, it's an ongoing process. You're always learning. During COVID, herbalists were communicating with each other, figuring it out. And I was learning then. And I figured out really basic things to do when there's a virus. We have herbs for viruses, Elderberry, for example, is incredible for viruses. All viruses, So I got through COVID that way. Before there were any shots or anything, I'm pretty sure I had it because I've never been that sick in my life. And because I knew about elderberry, I took elderberry and echinacea together every 2 hours, because that's the trick. You have to do it every 2 hours, unless you're sleeping. You don't wake up, to do it. But there was a lot of debate about, the cytokine storm and all this stuff. But no, it was the best thing ever. And every time I get a virus, or anytime I know somebody else has COVID, I bring over the tincture of elderberry and echinacea. And yeah, so I'm always learning. You're always learning.
What advice would you have for someone who wants to start off learning about plants and herbs, but maybe doesn't have access to um, a lot of things in the woods or a yard and a garden?
Well, there are teachers everywhere now. I mean, when I started out, there was nobody. People were desperate. Again, it's before the internet. People were thrilled to get the information. But now it's there. People are everywhere. But my advice would be to find an actual teacher. Don't just go online. Okay. Don't just Google things, because you don't know what you don't know. And find it like, and also, for example, you're in Florida. The plants in Florida are not the plants in Massachusetts. They're completely different plants. So you might have, I mean, I don't know anything really about the healing plants in Florida. It's just not something that I know about. So if I was in Florida, trying to find healing herbs, I wouldn't know where to start, and probably somebody from Florida, if they came to Massachusetts or Vermont or Maine, wouldn't have a clue, So the most important thing is to start in your own area, start in your own backyard, but find a teacher, get a real teacher um, who can answer your questions and introduce you to the plants where you are. And then, make a point of going to the conferences and the workshops. Be humble, because it takes years. Again, this is not something where you can watch a 1-minute TikTok video and then think that you know how to do something. It's not like that.
Well, I could probably ask you questions about herbs for a couple hours too, but I do want to ask you, other than your website and, of course, your Amazon author page and um, a couple other links that you've mentioned, where else can people find you online, and where can they find you in person coming up?
Well, I'm on Instagram at Ellen Evert Hopman. I'm on Facebook. Tribe of the Oak has a public page. We also have a private page for initiates, but we have about 2,000 people, I think, on the public page now. So if you look up Tribe of the Oak Druids Public Forum, something like that, you'll find us, and I'm there. I have an Ellen Evert Hopman author page on Facebook. I have another page called The Legacy of Druids, which is where I post a lot of archaeological stuff, and that's based on this book. but I do focus on archaeology. If you go to my website, elleneverthopman.com, you can contact me through there. If you have questions, you can write to me. Or if you go to the tribeoftheoak.org page, you can write to the Archdruid, the new Archdruid. If you're really interested in studying, you apply and have a one-on-one discussion with the Archdruid. If you just Google my name, stuff comes up.
Okay, perfect. I will post all of those links along with anything else that we've talked about in the video description. So again, anybody listening trying to find out more about Ellen, all you've got to do is click one of those links. So I know we're kind of getting late on our time here. I just have one more question to ask you, and it's the signature it's the signature question, Ellen. Okay, that's what I meant to say. Anyway, how do you use sound or music in your personal magical practice?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. The most wonderful experience that I can mention, for 30 years, I had groves at my house. They came every month. Each grove lasted about 10 years, and they came every month for 10 years. And that's a lot of work. But anyway, one grove that I had, we had a harp player who was in the group. And I live in the woods, and there's a natural stone circle behind the house, which is very convenient. I didn't have to do anything. It's just there. And that's where we do our ceremonies. So we decided to go out there one time and play for the fairies because, by tradition, the fairies love music. They love singing, they love dancing, they love music. So we went out there and we were playing music, and we stopped, and the music kept going. It continued, and we all heard it. So they were playing along with us. So my advice is, if you have any kind of an instrument, a flute, a guitar, a harp, something that you can take out into the wild, go to a wild area. Play for them. They love it. Let them know. Tell them. Say, hey, we're doing this for you. This is for you. And then you play for them, and maybe leave them some cookies or something, and see what happens. Because they really like it. But the further away you are from civilization, the more likely you're going to have an experience with the fairies. They really don't like, inner cities, although there's probably some, but in my experience, if you're in an old growth forest, or in a quiet woods somewhere, that's when they really come out. That's when they emerge.
Well, that's a beautiful story. And speaking from personal experience, I can say that music does tend to really get their attention sometimes. So if you do want to get their attention, that is certainly a way to go about it. But Ellen, I really appreciate you taking the time to come and be on the show today. I had a great conversation, and hope we can stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye. Another great interview and another big M3 thank you to Ellen for taking the time to be with me on the show today. I just finished her book, Celtic Druidry, and it was fantastic. I'm going to put that link as well as links to her other books in the video description below. Be sure to check them out. While you're clicking around down there, please make sure that you click the subscribe button here on YouTube. Guys, that makes such a big difference to me. And if you want to further support me, you can check out my Patreon page. Those links will also be in the video description below. By the way, check out this cool turtle that I found while I was out here. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. And just remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.